Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to A Gathering Place brought to you by the Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce. And it's been a minute that we've been live. It's been that summer vacation and everything going on, folks, with a lot of programming. And we've been live sporadically, but we are getting back into the groove. And this is a real groove, folks, because we have Dr. Hank Singleton joining us today. Forever in thy path. The God of Black Liberation is his most recent publication. Just published. And we wanted to bring him back on to talk about a bunch of stuff about Black liberation, the church and Black liberation, social justice movement. And I even might throw in a little bit of Lion King and a most recent appearance that I had at a Black church and just some thoughts about that. But we will get started with the show. You guys drop your questions and comments in the question and comment section because we want to hear from you. And we're going to get started right after this. Wrong opening, folks, so I apologize right after this.
Hello, I'm Marilyn Hemingway, and welcome to A Gathering Place. I said, I'm stepping back because we have young voices who want to be heard and they're moving on something.
Branding is really important to you and your business.
Even a basic type of technology, you learn it all.
And people are
Good question. Well, we're back, folks, and live TV, live podcast, live something. And I did the wrong opening, so I apologize. But hey, that's what happens with live. Let's just jump right into what we're doing today, because this is going to be a good show. Drop those questions. Hey, Hank, how are you?
Well, hello, my prom date. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Good to see you again.
It's always good to see you. Y'all, Hank and I've known each other since childhood. We've known each other so long, we have forgotten how long we've known each other. Yeah.
Or afraid to admit how long.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that too.
That too.
Yeah, our families go way back. So it's always good to get together and have these stimulating talks and just hanging out with family. And we got a lot to talk about. You got a new book out. And give us the title of your new book.
My new book, published by Orbis Books out of Marino, New York, that publishes a lot of Black liberation, Latin American liberation, theological manuscripts, is titled Forever in Thy Path, the God of Black Liberation. And of course, as the title suggests, I wanted to take straight aim at how God acts in history to effectuate liberation movements in oppressive contexts, and more particularly in the Black context that should not take a backseat to any other context of oppression anywhere in the world, that no matter how much the white media diminishes the significance of Black struggle, diminishes the significance of Black Lives Matter and every other movement prior to that, civil rights, Black power, the insurrectionist struggle, the civil rights movement, that God is acting in history, and God is acting in history as God did with the Israelites, taking them out of Egypt. And God chooses Israel and doesn't choose Egypt. He chooses Israel for their liberation and for their freedom. And that God also works actively in history in any other oppressive context. Of course, this one included in the Black liberation struggle, that our struggle for freedom is not sociologically engineered. It is, in fact, divinely engineered, just as the Israelite trek out of Egypt was divinely engineered by God. And so just as God was a God of Israelite liberation and biblical revelation, God is a God of liberation in the Black-white encounter in American history.
Can you speaking of divinely engineered, can you give us a specific example that would make someone who's not a theologian understand when you say divinely engineered?
Yeah, our Our understanding of reality is what I call sociologically engineered, which means that someone taught us, another human being taught us how we should think. Usually our parents, usually our community, even our churches teach us how we should think theologically. When I say something is divinely engineered, I do not mean that it emerges out of the community itself. It emerges out of divine revelation. It emerges out of the will of God as a people have encountered God in history. And as we look at the Black trek throughout history, from the hulls of ships even to the day, we have relied heavily on the on a God that would be with us through that trek, and did not see ourselves as getting out of that reality, particularly slavery, unless we did have the aid of a God that intervened in history. And the psychological reasoning behind that is that you were looking for a power that was more powerful than what became white supremacy itself. And so as Black people, we've always relied on the efficacy and the power of God to, number one, be more powerful than white supremacy, and number two, care enough about us in order to act in history along with our strivings for justice to bring about that freedom. And of course, as we look at that history and we see the Emancipation Proclamation, the end of slavery institutionally, we see the end of post-Reconstruction, we see the end of legal segregation, all being guided by Black strivings for freedom that have been informed by a liberating God, that we see how God has acted not only in Israelite history in biblical revelation, but how that God has acted in American history in guiding Black people from the hulls of ships to where we are today. No question about it, the struggle still continues, but the struggle still continues with the confirmation that we're being backed by a power that's bigger than white supremacy, and one that is able to overcome the power of oppressive death and bring about resurrected life to a people, which means that the resurrection of Jesus was not just meant to be a resurrection for individuals after physical death. That is more of a teaching of the white church, that the resurrection of Jesus is also the resurrection of a people, and also the resurrection of all forms of death, not just physical death, but also mental, moral, and spiritual death as well. And so I try to bring out these particular facets of death, and of course the resurrecting power of Jesus through God in the book, which is why I title it The God of Black Liberation.
So how do you tie in, as I listened to you and you listed off the Civil War, post-Reconstruction, etc., but Reconstruction, Civil War could be perceived as a movement forward, the ending of slavery. Reconstruction was, quote unquote, an investment in the recently emancipated enslaved to possibly give them equal footing, or at least opportunity towards equal footing. And there was always pushback. How does that fit into the Christianity that was taught to us on plantations and our forward movement?
It squares with it directly. And that's part of the formidability. In fact, the cornerstone of the formidability of the Black liberation movement. We are not only dealing with a pedagogy that we have been taught is divine, or that it comes from God, but also that we have internalized it in ways as Black people that we are not really fully cognizant of. That so much emphasis on the religious individual and one's personal relationship with God is a cue taken from the white Protestant church, so that Black people would never connect efficacy to transform their collective condition to Christianity. So much teaching in traditional Christianity about the institution of the church, which is why we're so churchy in terms of conceiving of church as a building and not as a reality. What we fail to miss, and conveniently because we have been taught not to make the connection, is that, of course, when Jesus commissioned the church to Peter, Jesus was not talking about a building. When he said, upon this rock, Petra in Greek is Peter, he was talking to Peter not about creating a building. He was talking to Peter about creating a transformative reality. And so Peter was the church. The church is a group of human beings. It's not bricks and mortar. But of course, from an ideological standpoint, white ministers taught us that the church was in fact building. And that's why there's always this church sweepstakes going on now between black pastors to see which one can have the most members and the most recently built building. Something we even buy into as black parishioners as well, because we have been taught this is the essence of the gospel. Again, taking our cue from the white church theologically. And then last but certainly not least, as it relates to the first point in particular, looking at religious efficacy solely through the lens of one's personal relationship with God. Even salvation is interpreted not in collective terms, not in liberation terms in history. It has always been exclusively translated in most church circles as what happens to the individual soul after physical death and when they go before God in judgment, looking for acceptance into a kingdom of heaven, or of course, not looking for the alternative to kingdom of hell. And so when you look at those three particular poles that I bring out in the book as well, we can see a definite theological imposition from the white Christian church that maybe most black preachers and black parishioners are not even aware of. They just came up in a black church in a black community, and Christian faith was being taught to them in this way. And it's come to take on a more prominent role in terms of how religion is taught to us, even beyond Christianity. But the reality is that the intent was not necessarily to make black people more righteous from an individual standpoint, but it was rather to sever any connection with biblical revelation, the Exodus narrative, David defeating Goliath, Jesus proclaiming his ministry as one of liberating the oppressed and proclaiming the acceptable will of the Lord, to sever that completely from black strivings for justice. Anything that relates a collective struggle for transformation to Christian faith, every attempt was made by white ministers to sever that link and to teach both their parishioners and black parishioners that looking at Christian faith from a collective transformative standpoint has nothing to do with the gospel of Jesus Christ. It is strictly an individualistic and personalistic phenomenon. And so that makes my job as a theologian even more formidable, because you end up not only taking on the white religious establishment, but you also end up taking on the black religious establishment. And of course, as we live in a highly anti-revolutionary America, it hadn't been revolutionary since it got its independence from Britain in the Revolutionary War. Then it became decidedly bourgeois and anti-revolutionary. One of the most revolutionary acts you can make as a human being is to try to trace why you believe something back to its origins, which is something that people who don't want you to become revolutionary don't want you to do. And so you're always confronted with great pushback, in this case from both black and white religious establishments, when you try to trace the origins of religious teaching back to their beginning. And in this case, fortunately for us, we've been able to find what that origin is. And that is a sinister white Christian teaching designed to make us not more righteous in the eyes of God and Jesus, but to make us better tools for white economic exploitation.
So you could say, with what you just said, you could say a couple of things. That when we hear pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, this individualistic economic empowerment, if you will, it's a middle class mentality of pull yourselves up by your bootstraps, and also anti-CRT, critical race theory, are embedded in this theology, this white Christian nationalistic theology of individualism. And how do you, and it is, you do hear it in the black church. And we were talking before the show started, and I was telling you, I wish I could just turn on this show and people could be behind the scenes with us, because we were talking about an anecdote of what happened to me recently. And I'm going to say it now because I think this is a good time to kind of point it out. And I was speaking at a black church, a community meeting at a black church in Little River, South Carolina. And before I was, part of my introduction, before I spoke, was the black minister was talking about an encounter he had with a white minister about Black Lives Matter. And the white minister was bringing up Marxism, feminism, and LGBTQ. And he wanted me to kind of speak upon it. And the first thing I said was, I'm a feminist. I am not a Marxist, but I dare say that this is a country of freedom of choice, freedom of speech. So if you want to be a Marxist, that's actually your right to be a Marxist. All right. It's not your right to be an insurrectionist. So that's another conversation. And then regarding LGBTQIA, I basically said that's a matter of privacy. I don't want you in my business. Actually, I said I don't want you in my bedroom, and I don't want to be in yours either, because it's a matter of privacy, and that's part of the makeup of our country. It's not explicitly stated in the Constitution, but privacy, a lot of our amendments is based on privacy, and your free will and your choice. Yet America, because of this religion and church that we've been taught through a plantation system, a plantation mentality, actually contradicts itself. But Jesus did not contradict himself.
No.
Jesus, as you say, was not in the four walls. Jesus turned over the tables. Jesus was out with the people. Jesus was feeding the people. So what I find now is the contradiction of the church, and in particular the Black church. I went further to say that the Black church is actually not conservative. I think subliminal messages from this white nationalistic Christianity that has been a part of the fabric of our country since day one has subliminally taught us to say, oh, Black people are conservative. But what does that mean? Because at this point, the Republican Party is it's not even operating as a party. So what does it mean being conservative? Does that mean that you don't love your LGBTQIA brothers and sisters? Does this mean that you have these prejudices and bias that you embrace them? Or are we progressive in the sense that the Black community has held this country responsible for what it has put on paper? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that all men are created equal. That's progressive. That speaks of a collective progression.
Absolutely.
And I love the fact that you talk collectively, but I think subliminally, we have bought into this individualistic theory and not realizing it. And it's a little bit of intellectual laziness to say that the Black community is conservative, because if we were conservative, we would not have had the civil rights movement. We would have not done what we could in Reconstruction. As a matter of fact, I dare say we would not even have the public school system, because during Reconstruction, it was mostly majority Black controlled legislators, House and Senate, that created public school education. So how does this tie into now, this movement? Where do you see this, your book that you've recently written, play a part in this? Where does it take us to moving forward?
Well, everything you said was absolutely on point. No question about it. What that white minister in 2022, where you spoke, revealed to you is that we're still dealing with the issue today. That in light of our progression theological, there's still those of the white religious establishment, white Christian establishment, who are still trying to pound what they consider to be an orthodox reality, impose an orthodox reality on everybody else. An orthodoxy that emerges out of being white, being male, being Protestant, being heterosexual. And if you don't fall under one of those four categories, then there's something else that needs to be done in order for you to get closer to God. And this was the theology emerging on the plantation. The theology emerging on the plantation was that since out of Christian stewardship, whites have been demanded by God to enslave Blacks to expose them to civilization, then white people are the superior race of people on earth. Therefore, Jesus must be white and God must be white. And so it gives white ministers then and now the unquestioned right to teach people of color and women in matters divine, because they're simply inferior. And so my book addresses that and maintains that, no, we were not created, that when white people made the decision to enslave Black people, it deviated from God's plan, who created us all in God's image, which ironically is where the language of our Constitution comes from. that one nation under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all, comes from the biblical notion that God created all of us in God's image, not just white people in God's image, but all of us, and that it was an act of freedom. And so, in light of that, we were created in freedom and not created to be bondsmen and bondswomen. And so, one of the things that I address in the book is that, you cannot have a kingdom of God, which is what the Slavocracy was styled as, and at the same time create a context of bondage. The two are totally incompatible. You can't say on the one hand you're working to realize God's rule, and on the other hand refuse to recognize the God worth, the equal God worth in the humanity of people of color and women, which is what fundamentally all American problems of collective human domination have been about. And so my book addresses that, particularly in the chapter on the path of righteousness, where I maintain that, of course, divine righteousness in an oppressive context must be measured with one's desire and ability to stand with the oppressed as they struggle for freedom and self-determination to create that society of one nation under God. Because from day one, we have not been one nation, we have been two nations, particularly racially, and we have been two nations in terms of a privileged group and an underprivileged group. And so in that sense, we have lived not one history in America, but we have lived two histories in America. And there are people in 2022 who still want us to continue to live those two histories, one of acute privilege and one, of course, of acute deprecation, namely because it benefits them. And of course, they want those who don't benefit from it to accept it as a condition, not only for American living, but one of the things I'll try to bring out in the book as well is that they want you to accept it as a condition for Christian living. And that at the end of the day, no person who is a Christian at heart in a real sense can accept a subordinate status as a way of being Christian in the world in which God created all of us equally.
So in the book, do you address how do we reconcile this duality of the founding of this country? And if we reconcile it, does that include death? Because Jesus died on the cross for our sins and rose from the dead. Will it take death to reconcile the duality that you just spoke of?
Well, it's going to take death, but the genius of Christian anthropology is that death is not the final answer. And so, yes, what the Christ event showed us was that in a world where the brokers of power and those who are committed to the will to power don't mind killing human flesh in order to perpetuate their privileged existence, death is inescapably a part of it. We've seen that with numerous slaves being killed. We saw that with the insurrectionists being killed. We saw that with our leaders. We've seen that with our leaders being assassinated. We've seen it with people who weren't leaders, who were participating in demonstrations. Jimmy Lee Jackson being shot at point blank range in Selma. We see people being gunned down by not only white civilians, but of course, as we deal with today, even so-called white progenitors of the law, the rule of law, as they call it. And so death has become and is an inescapable part. The genius of Christian anthropology for me is that death is not the final answer, because despite the traumatic deaths that have occurred and that we have witnessed, recorded in our DNA even today, whether it's Jimmy Lee Jackson, whether it's Martin Luther King, whether it's Malcolm X, whether it's Emmett Till, whether it's any of them, the reality is that it still has not softened or lessened our desire for freedom. And I maintain in the book that non-lessened desire for freedom from the contemporary generation of Black people, even watching George Floyd publicly executed on television a couple of years ago, has not caused our fervor for liberation to wane. And the reason why it hasn't caused our liberation for fervor to wane is because we are not the originators of that fervor. That fervor comes from another source that instills in us constantly through the whole notion that, lo, I'll be with you always to the end of time, that it comes from a superior or supreme power that always has been with us and guiding us and maintaining that, yes, this has happened. This person has gotten killed. This person has gotten executed. I know you're down now, but your liberational fervor has never been diminished. We call it the spirit in religion, that you can kill the flesh, but you can never kill the spirit. Not only are we talking about the spirit of the religious individual, but we're also talking about the spirit of communities as it struggles for freedom and self-determination. So whether that be LGBTQ, whether that be womanist, feminist, whether that be Black liberation struggle, whether that be Mayorista, Latino, Latina, whether it be the 2/3 world struggle in its collectivity, that there's always a liberational fervor that's being instilled in us to continue despite the traumatic nature of our past and what we have experienced, namely because we are not the source of it. And that's the crux of what I try to bring out in the book.
I'm going to bring what you just said, which was beautifully said and stated. I'm going to bring it to pop culture.
Okay.
And I said I was going to bring Lion King into this, and also Black Panther, because they're both actually based on Hamlet. And before Hamlet, African folklore. So let's get that straight too. All right. But I just saw on TikTok this morning. So TikTok must have, the algorithm brought me, they must have known we were going to talk about this afternoon. But there was a gentleman speaking on Lion King and how Lion King was about spiritual colonization. The collective colonization, spiritual. He didn't say the individual. It was a spiritual colonization. But Scar, the character Scar, was the main character when you look at spiritual colonization, and he got into how Scar was reacting from fear and everything that he did because of childhood trauma, et cetera, et cetera. But it manifested it physically in the scar on Scar's face, his coloring, et cetera. And as the gentleman was speaking, I was thinking in terms of racism, feminism, LGBT, of oppressed people, colonized people. And Scar, his thing was Scar was reaching out not from love, a place of love, but from a place of fear. And because Scar did not love himself, and he was projecting on the individuals, his Mustafa, his brother, he hated Mustafa because he hated himself. And as this guy was speaking, I'm thinking, okay, here's a white person attacking Black people because the white person I cannot find love in myself. I can't love you. And life has taught me one thing, and if people hang around me long enough, they will hear me say, if I don't give myself grace, I can't give you grace.
Right.
If I don't love me, I can't love you. And we're not talking romantic love. We're talking love, just love. So if you take this to a place of colonization, when you go into spaces where you don't love yourself and you cross waters and go someplace and you commit genocide, you're not coming from a place because you don't love yourself.
Right.
It's this. So do you truly know the love of God? That if you don't love yourself and then you project it on others and you are actually murdering others, you're murdering yourself. With that being said, and the Christianity that was taught us here in America, and what you just said, what keeps us going back to the well that feeds the fervor that we have for liberation? And I think that's what you just said.
Yeah. Well, let me put it in the context in which you put it.
Yes.
The struggle for freedom and self-determination always has a self-critical function in it that allows us to continually reinvent ourselves and catapult our thinking to the next level that's needed in order to strategize to move us in our generation. going along the notion that what, in this case, Black people did in previous generations may have worked in, but doesn't necessarily work now. Scar's spiritual struggle in The Lion King is a prime example of one of the most virulent manifestations. As an educator, I've always maintained that the slave master denying us the ability to read and write was the worst sin. But others have countered, and rightfully so, I agree with them. They have countered and said, no, Dr. Singleton, the worst thing in the manifestation of white oppression on Black people is teaching Black people to not love themselves. And even as we have this conversation today, there are Black people who are not able to understand why Black people malign each other and kill each other even in unprecedented numbers, particularly as we got more access to weapons of mass destruction, and particularly as we live generations of unfulfillment of this so-called American dream to effectively mainstream us into the fullness of American life. And this has been particularly the case with young Black men, but with young Black women as well in every generation, that the teaching that our Black skin was somehow demonic and a manifestation of the devil, the manifestation of Satan, and that our texture of our hair and our broad nose is that thick lips that deviated from typical European aesthetic features are somehow a manifestation of a curse, and that white aesthetic features are a manifestation of the angel or of that which is divine, have always created a dilemma for Black people relative to self-image. And I think, taking your example from Scar and The Lion King, that you're right, that grace is freely given by God, but that grace has to be received. And in order for that grace to be received, you have to love yourself. And so part of the struggle of theology of grace, wherein grace is freely given by God to affirm one's humanity and to make one a not only willing but a capable vessel in the liberation struggle, is predicated upon self-love. And so for insurrectionists, you're fighting two struggles. You're fighting a struggle against white power brokers, but you're also fighting a struggle for a better aesthetic presentation and image of your own people. And it hadn't been lost on our entertainers as well. James Brown comes along and says, "Say it loud, I'm Black and I'm proud." Because he understood that in order for Black people to be truly free, they had to love themselves. And I also deal with that in the introduction of the book as well, as it relates to Black self-image and the capacity to love. Because if the capacity of love is somehow truncated, and is in Black people, by centuries of telling them that they're less than God or that they're ungodly and they're not worthy of God's love, then that also becomes an integral part of the new pedagogy, of the new way of being Black, of the transformative way of being Black, that enables us to love our Black bodies, our Black selves. And that will go a long way in minimizing a lot of the intracommunal violence that we see in our community.
I wrote down 4 questions. Because I said, make sure we got these questions. And we did. I did not ask those questions directly, but we did get them answered, I believe. Let me, what do we want the reader to take from the book? What was your thinking going into the book? Why do you need it at this time? And how does it, I was scribble. How does it differ from previous works? I don't think let's get to that one. I wanted to make sure, I think in our conversation, we answered the questions.
Yes,
but this one,
to some degree.
To some degree. So I'm going to be really direct with this one, though. Mm-hmm. How does this book differ from your other books? And how does it move the conversation forward?
Well, going back to your white minister's erroneous prognostications, that talking about God within the context of collective human struggle is not a pseudo form of Marxism. Okay. Marx was more of a prophet than any white minister to me, because, of course, Marx maintained that it's not that I don't believe in God, but everywhere I see the word God being mentioned the most, I also see a context of human oppression of one group over another and using the name of God to justify that domination. And in that sense, Marx was more of a prophet than just about any white racist minister. This book is, with that as my backdrop, this book is different in that I wanted to convey to the reader that they are not alone in their struggle for Black self-determination and freedom. It is not a novel statement, but sometimes when we see the resurgence of white supremacy, we see the emergence of a Donald Trump, who inspired a whole generation of white racist extremists with Oath Keepers and QAnon and a generation of white extremists who, coming off an era of two-term Black president, were feeling like they had to push back to establish their dominance. That's, you mentioned, RRT, racial replacement theory. And I wanted the reader to understand, in the midst of this resurgence of white hatefulness of Black bodies, that there's still one on the throne. Despite the diverse approaches to Christianity, there is still one on the throne, and that one on the throne is still with us. And that in the context of that struggle, there are going to be setbacks, and there's going to be pushback from a community that have been taught that they are right in pushing back. And so I wanted to let the reader know that our resurgence as a people in the struggle for our freedom and self-determination is not sociologically engineered, but that there's one behind the scenes that's behind us and with us, in, with, among, and through us, that is also participating as that God did in biblical revelation, and as we saw in Jesus' commitment to his ministry. And so in that sense, I wanted to not only make sure I included in this statement that for us as Black people, we do not have to take a back seat to anyone when it comes to our theology, particularly as it relates to a God that has been with us from the holes of ship to the day, no matter how much it is made fun of or reduced in its significance by white theologians, that there is still a God on scene that is infusing our liberation struggle. And in that sense, it's different from the previous works where I was dealing more with Christian anthropology, and more particularly with white religious teachings, and how at their origins, as I mentioned earlier, when we trace religious teachings and Christian teachings back to their origin, we can find, when it's not good for Black people theologically, that we find some white minister and some white theologian who are advocating these particular theological constructs. And so I wanted to make sure that I was speaking directly about God's activity in history, not as someone who is unconcerned about human history, not someone who is unconcerned about human relationships, and more important, as someone who is not concerned about Black suffering. I wanted to make sure I conveyed to the reader and put it in a way that you couldn't miss it, that not only is God concerned about human suffering and Black suffering, but God is also informing our continued efforts to eliminate that suffering. And that is consistent with the biblical witness itself, and that is consistent with Christian faith as it has been conceived by this theologian itself.
How do we... So I'll start here. With COVID, many folks are not going back into church, not only because of COVID and the physical appearance in church and the mask and everything, but also because they feel they're not connected to the church anymore. Mm-hmm. So with what you just said, and I'll say this myself, and in the past, in recent past, I have said, what have we done so bad that Black folks are treated so badly here? What did we do that angered God so much that we're treated the way we're treated? And so let me tie this in, not going back to church, folks not going back to church. Mm-hmm. How do we hear God when he's speaking to us to know that he's with us?
Well, I let me begin with your first point. Um, we may never see church be the same again, and I don't necessarily consider that a bad thing. Again, the whole notion of church as a building that people go to is more business and economically generated than it is anything else. And of course, the more people you can get to come, the more people you produce, and the more leadership can make money. I'm not trying to sell them out on the altar of business and economics, but there's a profound economic factor to having packed churches every Sunday. That Black people are not as in tune to giving through Cash App and other technological outlets and sources as maybe other people are. There are some Black people who may not even have a checking account. And so I'm not making mockery. I'm just simply saying that that is in fact the case. And so that is more business generated than anything else. I think what we all have to keep in mind as confessing Christian is not allow people to define what church is for you. That's a white teaching that extends back to the plantation and began with trying to create business and economic opportunities for white Christian leaders in the life of the church. And then, of course, in the building of theological seminaries, all of which I am for, but not necessarily within the context of diminishing the significance of the liberation struggle in the life of the church. Church remains a human undertaking and not a building undertaking. It remains a state of the heart and not a state of how recently built your church was. And so as with that as our foundation, I think my job as a theologian is to make sure that the impulse by which we hear God is not necessarily a call for us to be what we were. Because in every generation, even the Bible itself speaks of a new creation, a new testament, a new Jerusalem, as I close the book with, coming down from heaven to create a new reality in history, not in heaven, but in history on this earth. And so my job as a theologian is to make sure that these aspects of faith are an essential part of what it is to hear God. That to hear God in a transformative way is to hear God within the context of a church that is universal in its commitment to liberation, not necessarily universal in it having a physical address. And so as we create a new way of being Christian, I by no means want to see people stop going to a building that we call church. But I do want them to take with them a renewed conscience, not necessarily for the same doctrine, but a renewed conscience for a different doctrine that is not so concentrated in the religious individual and otherworldliness and buildings, but is more concentrated in a revolutionary understanding of the Bible that serves the needs of the oppressed community at the behest of God self. That God is not an impartial God, that our God is a highly partial God in favor of the downtrodden, in favor of the abused, humiliated, and the marginalized. And so if I have imbibed that message and the implications of it as it relates to my self-image and my being someone who's worthy of my liberation, then in that sense, I am church. In that sense, I am a member of God's household of freedom, as Letty Russell titled one of her books, a feminist theologian, Household of Freedom. And that in that sense, I am a part of the household of freedom and subsequently of not only Jesus's church, but whether I'm Catholic or not, meaning universal, I am a member of Peter's church as well. It sounds a little altruistic on the surface, but it's part of the profound theological development, in my judgment, that must take place if we're going to understand church in its purest and most profound sense.
So does this mean, as you were writing this book and I'm listening to you, as you were writing this book, and I'm going to use this word because it's been popping up more and more. As you were writing this book, were you thinking in terms or not of someone reading this book is going to deconstruct what they've been taught, to grasp Black liberation, to grasp the spiritual understanding of Black liberation.
Yes, because it the new consciousness of which I spoke cannot happen aside from deconstruction, because you have to deconstruct what has been constructed. And again, that's one of my tasks as a theologian in this society. It is to engage in a process of deconstruction in the sense that I've inherited an oppressive context as a Black man in this society. And so the understanding of the gospel emerges out of that oppressive context. And since I have inherited and know that I have inherited a Christian theology that sought never to get Black people to connect their pursuit for freedom with Christian faith, that my job as a theologian is to deconstruct that notion and to maintain the opposite, that your strivings for freedom are not just social, economic, and political in nature, but they are profoundly theological, religious, and spiritual in nature. That we are talking about a spiritual struggle here, a sacred struggle, if you would, that is just as sacred as baptism, that is just as sacred as prayer at the altar, that is just as sacred as singing on the choir, that is just as sacred as preaching a sermon to a congregation every Sunday. That gathering in the brush harbors in slavery, not only to worship, but to plot insurrection, was a sacred moment for Denmark Vesey, Nat Turner, Gabriel Prosser to plot that insurrections, even though they failed in their particularity, was a sacred moment because it led to the sacredness of the liberation struggle itself. And for a nation to see even more so, even in their deaths, in a redemptive way, that slavery was more and more something that we needed to look upon societally and nationally as an immoral institution, and therefore an ungodly and unchristian institution. And so it cannot happen except through deconstruction, unfortunately.
With deconstruction, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is about, you have to deconstruct, you have to remove what was taught. Mm-hmm. that bubble that you're in, the not armor, but it is an armor because it's holding. People forget we're taught, put on the armor of God. We're putting things away from us. What we don't talk about when you put armor on is you're holding things in also. Mm-hmm. So to deconstruct, you have to remove those shields that hold you back.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's an inauthentic armor, Marilyn. It is not a divinely rooted armor. It is an ideologically distorted armor. It is an armor that is designed to shield you from people like me who do talk deconstruction. And it is designed for confessing Christians to see me through white Christian teaching as demonic, as satanic, as someone who's trying to take you off of the straight and the narrow path. And so even when we talk about cherished Christian expressions like the armor of God, even they have to be deconstructed because they've been constructed with the armor of white superiority. Mm-hmm. And so when Black people think that they're coming out, when they come out against someone who's trying to deconstruct, they don't understand that they're coming out against the antithesis of what it is they think they're confessing. So that makes my job even more difficult. We have to keep in mind that Jesus was crucified not just simply because he was the Son of God. Jesus was crucified because he was a threat to the religious, social, economic, and political establishment of his time. Mm-hmm. And Jesus didn't stay away from that deconstructing process. Jesus challenged them publicly and publicly humiliated them, which even upped the ante for them to want to rid him from the society. It was actually, in all of our talk about sacredness and revelation and purity, it was really a political and social move designed to get rid of someone who dare challenge them on not only their social, economic, and political outlay, but also on the way they thought religiously. The religious leaders in first century Palestine, that Jesus always tripped up. Good Samaritan is a prime example. He chose the Samaritans, a despised people, didn't choose the priest and didn't choose the Levite, which was the established religious leadership of that time. He was making a statement of deconstructing that the way you have been doing it must now come to an end. And I am bringing a new covenant that's not necessarily rooted in frequent church attendance, tithes giving, and spirited worship services, but it's rooted in a way of recognizing the inherent equal worth of all human beings, including those that you have branded as being demonic, as being worthy of contempt, as worthy of being hated, worthy of being marginalized, like the Samaritans and like the Jews. I come and stand with them and against your way of life and against your theology. That fundamentally is why he was crucified. And so as we parlay that into a 21st century existence, then it must mean, as we have inherited an oppressive context, that anyone who claims to follow Jesus must look at the religious establishment that has constituted this historic reality in America and conclude that it's not Christian, but it's anti-Christian. That is not Jesus, but it's anti-Jesus. That is not godly, but it's ungodly. That is not Christian, but it is unchristian. The problem is that in all four of those categories, we have been actually taught that they are godly, authentic, Christian, which then creates the animus against anyone like me or Jesus, not comparing myself to Jesus, but anyone, whether it be Martin Luther King Jr., whether it be Malcolm X, whether it be Fannie Lou Hamer, whether it be Stokely Carmichael, whether it be Harriet Tubman, whether it be Frederick Douglass, all of them maintain that we were dealing with a God that stands with the oppressed in a context of bondage and oppression, and that any theology, Christian or otherwise, that claims that we can talk about God in the same breath as legitimating an oppressive context has no right to exist theologically in a free society. That's what our foreparents have said, and that's what I'm saying today. And so deconstruction then becomes inescapable in the process of creating a God-like and a Jesus-like theological world.
So if I want to purchase your book, because you said a word, and I'm sitting there and I'm hearing all of it, and as you speak in my mind, all these examples are going through my mind in present day time of what you just said. It's not just biblical in the sense like it's a history book and this is a long time ago. This is happening right now. It's happening right now. And if it's happening right now, what can we do? Because we got like 7 minutes left. So 5 minutes. What can we do as individuals to be part of this Black liberation? First
of all, we have to be willing to go through a process where deconstruction is upon us, which is why my role as a book writer is so important. One of the best ways in this society to deconstruct is to write a book. And so in that sense, we must be a more well-read community, and we must be a community that commits itself not just to a God-inspired liberation movement, but also see divine reality in the Black Lives Matter movement, to see it in the feminist movement, to see it in the womanist movement, to see it in the Black liberation movement. These movements are not alien to divine reality. They're not alien to the will of God. They are expressions of the will of God in an oppressive context. And so we must take traditional teaching and stand it on its head. The second thing that we must do is that we must not discard the need for mass mobilization. The need for mass mobilization is still very much needed in our day and time to continually expose racial bias in American life, whether it be police brutality, whether it be voting rights. Water is still contaminated in Flint, Michigan, still today, when it wouldn't have been contaminated for 3 days, if that, in a white community. That we still see this disparity of justice in American life, particularly as it relates to jobs and as it relates to education as well. We must continually be vigilant in seeing our struggles to change those realities as not being separated from the salvation liberation process, but as an integral part of the salvation liberation process. And of course, what we must ultimately do is that we must abandon notions that we're dealing primarily with a personal phenomenon. That's one of the Achilles heels of Christian faith that distorts it the most. The question we should be asking ourselves is not how I can get to heaven after I die. But the question we should be asking ourselves is, how can I sacrifice the one life I have so I can catapult humanity to a new state of freedom and consciousness? That's what Jesus did. And that's why God became Jesus. That the Christ event was not a paradigm, was not an event. It was not designed for us to look at that and say, well, Jesus did that 2,000 years ago. I'm glad I ain't got to do it today. Salvation is mine. No, that's a white way of looking at it. That's a divested way of looking at it. The more accurate way of looking at it is saying that just as there was a cross for Jesus, there's a cross for me and there's a cross for you. In fact, there's an old hymn of the church, speaking of the church that we sing. And so we must realize ultimately that to be a confessing Christian and a follower of Jesus, that the Christ event was not an event, but it was a paradigm. And that a cross awaits us as it awaits Jesus. But that's the good news, because as the cross awaits us, Christian anthropology teaches us that death is not the final answer. And so as our fleshy bodies, we're going to leave this earth one day anyway. The question is, how did we leave, and what type of legacy did we leave behind in terms of informing more of a liberating spirit in the time in which God gave us, as we saw with Jesus. And so if we don't begin to, if we begin to look at Christian faith within the context of those matrices, then it could very well lead to a more revolutionary presence in American and global life that will effectuate substantive change.
So this becomes then a choice of free will and action oriented. And action oriented, going back to my life. What have I done in my life for my community, for the collective? And that's action. Action takes a decision. You have to make a decision of
Yes.
a spiritual revolution, and that's free will. Okay.
Yeah. You must free yourself to choose liberation. And if you don't free yourself,
and once you make that decision, you must take action.
Right. And once you free yourself to choose liberation, then you must open yourself up to a process where you begin to internalize deconstructing theories relative to what you've been taught all your life. And that's always a very difficult task for all of us. It was a very difficult task for me, although I was never really given over to traditional Christianity like a lot of other Black Christians. But it still weighed on me tremendously. Until I understood that fundamentally I was not engaged in a process that was about me. And that's what white Christian teaching has taught us. It is not about our individual selves. It is about how we use our individual selves to make the community better, not only the Black community, but the world community. And of course, we go to church every Sunday now, speaking of church again, and shout about what Jesus Christ did for us. And at the same time, miss the very reason why Jesus was crucified. And if we allow ourselves to understand why Jesus was crucified and why are we 2,000 years later at church every Sunday shouting about him and praying to him, then it would make it easier for us to make the choice for liberation, because Jesus chose the little ones, he chose the voiceless, and he chose the exploited. And I can't think of any other people in America that relates to more than Black people in America. And so to choose the Samaritans and the Israelites in first century is to choose Black people today. And that doesn't mean that you are engaged in racism in reverse. It doesn't mean that you are not being a true Christian. No, you've been a false Christian before that when you were engaged in a universal understanding of the gospel. But a universal understanding of the gospel is more of a white teaching. The real teaching is that God, and through Jesus, picks those who have been picked on. As we say, as I've heard some preachers say, to disturb the comfortable and to comfort the disturbed. And so in that sense, once you make the decision for liberation, that you understand that this is not really about you or about all people. It is about making whole the condition of a particular people, people who are voiceless and people who are exploited.
I must say that what you just said, I see and hear and live it in my personal journey, that I would not be sitting here today if I had not started that journey for myself to not knowing, I hear the term deconstruct now, but I've been uncomfortable in the church for a long time because I was questioning my faith because what I was hearing in the church was not feeding what was fighting to come out of me.
Yes. Yes.
And I think we're all going to be on that journey until we close our eyes for the final time. But in that journey, I think we experience many transformations. It's not just one transformation. It's going to be many transformations.
Right.
Until we close our eyes for the time, for the physical time.
Right.
But for that final spiritual transformation, that's where life eternal.
Yes.
But in the transformation that I am experiencing, I see your words. So, yeah, I confess I haven't read the book yet. That's why I got the questions.
Shame on you.
Yeah, shame on. But if we don't have any other reason to read this book now, and all of Dr. Singleton's books, because this is an arc, and you hear it in the words of Martin Luther King when he said the arc is long, it bends to justice. But you also hear it in John Lewis, because so many times we stop, just like we only see one portion of why Jesus died on the cross for our sins. We also, with John Lewis, we talk about John Lewis's, good trouble. Most people don't repeat what's even probably more important is necessary trouble.
Yes.
Necessary trouble is the transformation. You're compelled. Necessary trouble means you're compelled to create good trouble.
Exactly.
And that's a spiritual evolution. That's a spiritual revolution to get from good trouble to necessary trouble, because you're compelled spiritually to create this trouble. And it's trouble not because you're protesting. We forget that too.
Right. It's
trouble because you're changing systems. You're throwing over the table in the temple with the necessary trouble. And necessary trouble is the trouble that goes for generations. That's why we still talk about Martin Luther King more than 50 years after his assassination. That's why we will continue talking about John Lewis 50, 100 years after his death. But we got to understand, we got to finish the quote. Good trouble, necessary trouble, because it is talking about the spiritual transformation.
Right. And that's why deconstruction, again, is very important, because getting into good trouble is not just a social or political statement. It is also a profound theological statement. Jesus got into good trouble, and that's why he was crucified. Martin Luther King got into good trouble, and that's why he was assassinated. But funny you should mention your struggle growing up in the church and not seeing a liberating hermeneutic come through as clearly in the liturgy and the preaching church. I too struggled with that growing up, and my father was a social activist and an NAACP president as well as a pastor. But you mentioned King also, and what I mentioned in the book, as we were talking about the book, on two occasions, I mentioned King. And, we almost lost one of the greatest ministers in a generation of any race, because growing up in Ebenezer Baptist Church, his father, Daddy King, preached a lot of fire and brimstone sermons. And for King, they were not socially relevant enough. And so he sat on a pew in Ebenezer growing up and struggled with the content of theology. And it was embedded in him early on. And so he thought that the ministry wasn't for him, because this was the tenor of religious language in the pulpit from not only his father, but most other ministers. And that they engage in what we call the celebratory hoop at the end of the sermon. But even before that, the sermon stayed in the Bible and was not relevant to the time in which they found themselves. And for young King, this created an identity crisis for him relative to Christian faith. He didn't know it was for him or not. And so he abandoned notions of a calling, even though he thought he was experiencing one. And he kind of put it in the back of his mind until he went to Morehouse College and met Benjamin Mays, who I started the book with, and his book, The Negro's God, which was the first real intellectual study on Black people's appropriation of God. I talk about The Negro's God by Benjamin Mays in the introduction of the book. But he was the president of Morehouse College when King enrolled there. And King went by his office and talked to him about his struggle. It was Benny Mays who told him, no, don't abandon your ministerial leanings. We need more ministers like you. You are on the right track. And it was because of that talk with Benjamin Mays that Dr. King did become a minister. And of course, the rest is history as he went on to Crows in Boston University and then to the Civil Rights Movement. But we almost missed out on one of the greatest ministers in not only Black history, but world history because of that, that teaching in Black churches that doesn't necessarily lend itself to social relevance. That's why I say that we have to create a new church. We have to undergo a theological renaissance so that, young kings, before they become ministers, can see that liberating language is a fundamental part of the Black church and the Black religious, the Black Christian experience. And we have to make our young people understand that when they engage in movement, they're not just engaged in something purely social. That's a white teaching. Not only something purely social, but purely demonic. But no, the opposite of that. They're engaged not only in social struggle, but they're engaged in a profound salvation struggle for the salvation of humanity and the liberation of their people.
I think those are the words that we need to end this conversation with. We actually went over a little bit, 7 minutes over our time, but it was good. It really was. And I want to remind everyone that you can purchase Forever in Thy Path, The God of Black Liberation by Dr. Hank Singleton at orbisbooks.com. Please go there now and order that book. I'm gonna get your book.
You can also get it at Amazon.com as well.
Yeah. I posted those Amazon.com, Barnes and Noble. I did a little Google on you, so it's
okay.
There.
And if Barnes and Noble doesn't have it, they can order it for you. I always like that because they take care of the shipping for you. So
yeah. And now y'all need to join it too. Join BarnesandNoble.com. Join their book club. I'm a member of their book club. So go ahead, Barnes. I love Barnes and Noble.
And then the first 3 books. Black Theology, Ideology, White Religion, Black Humanity, and Divine Revelation, Human Liberation, you can go to my webpage, harrysingleton.com. You click on the book and it'll take you straight to the ordering information if you want to order it that way. I have yet to post this book on my website for you to go straight from there to the ordering information at Orbis, but I'm in the process of doing that this week. So
y'all go to harrysingleton.com because he has his previous books. We want to support him all around because I'm telling you, just you coming on for these few minutes, I feel growth. I feel, every time I talk to you, I grow a little bit more. And I know others are also. We've had some very good comments. Eric Grant, thank you. Latasha Counts Elliott, thank you. Eric has one change brought by COVID that I've welcomed and benefited from. It's the opportunity through Zoom, YouTube, Facebook to hear ministers and theologians who are socially engaged. Absolutely. That's true, Eric. Yeah, that's very true.
Very good point.
Yeah, I saw something once again on TikTok, and they were actually talking about dumb people coming together on social media, but we too often forget that people, theologians, socially engaged people have a voice too. That's the power of social media. We're bringing this here because fortunately for some of ours, we do have some sponsors, not for this Sunday, but other grants and things that allow us to continue these conversations. So Eric, you are quite right. And Latasha has been posting. She's gotten a lot out of this today. Also, she's going to introduce it to her book club in October. All right. So
thank you so much.
Yeah, I know you guys are going to look forward to that. And we could go to harrysingleton.com for his first 3 books. And then we'll come back to this one, orbisbooks.com, to order Forever in Thy Path, The God of Black Liberation. You know, we're going to have you back on.
Oh, it would be my pleasure. I wouldn't have it any other way.
When you're ready to come back on, maybe we'll have you back on around October to talk further now that the book is out and everything, and you can update us and give us some more thoughts and everything. But I'm telling you, every time you come on, I'm pushed. I'm pushed to my head. I can feel it even in my head. And I'm having more and more of these type of conversations. Just had one today, ran into some folks at dinner, and we talked about deconstruction, in particular the Black church. The Black church, the deconstruction that needs to happen. And I'm saying this, I'm speaking for Maryland, that the Black church is going to have to wake up to that deconstruction, or the Black church will not survive. And that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah. And I want to thank you too, because there are not a lot of liberating spaces out there with which to have this conversation, particularly for a theologian. And so I want to thank you for the invite, and thank you for opening up your format to this discussion. We need more Black journalists, and we need more Black formats like this, where we can have this kind of candid conversation about the future of the Black Christian experience and the future of Black people in America and the world. And so I thank you for offering this format, and continue the good work with Gullah Geechee.
Thank you. You're welcome very much. And that's a good time to end it, isn't it? All right, everybody, go ahead and order his book. Dr. Hank Singleton, thank you for joining us today. Looking forward to you coming back. And yes, I'm going to go buy that book because I've got to read that now. I'm ready for it.
Looking forward to talking with you about it.
We'll see you later. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
All right. So that was Reverend Dr. Hank Singleton joining us today. And y'all, that was a deep conversation today. And before the show started, we talked a little bit. And I was like, man, I wish I could just turn it on right now and people can hear, because we're catching up. But we're also doing kind of like those behind scenes conversations, and it leads right into these conversations that we've enjoyed with you for this past hour. Thank you for joining us today. Our next show is this Wednesday, and then join us for a gathering place at 4:00. And then I'm still working on my guest, so I'm not going to introduce that. But this third Sunday coming up, next Sunday, politics talk. So we're going to go from the theology, the Black liberation, to politics. And yes, folks, it does inform our politics and why we need to vote, especially young folks. You're not voting just for one thing that you're going to get. Literally, you're voting for revolution. We're voting for revolution. So thank you for joining us today. Thank you, everyone. And let me see what I have here. Thank you, Latasha. It was an amazing show, wasn't it? Really appreciate you coming on. And I want to remind everybody to please go to YouTube and subscribe to our channel, Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce. Subscribe so we can build up our numbers, and then go to our Facebook pages and our Twitter and like us and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube and Instagram, Gullah Geechee Chamber of Commerce. We're over that. And LinkedIn also. So we're trying to hit all of those social media accounts. And TikTok is coming soon. We want to be out there and sharing the good news, the good trouble, the necessary trouble. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. You have enjoyed the rest of your weekend, and we'll see you later. Good night.